I am not the expert on geopolitics.
Ugh. Wow, wouldn't it be great if I was a politician so I could just sit back and collect a fat paycheck for knowing nothing while being completely corrupt and selling out my constituents? That'd be a lot easier than doing this, let me tell you. Okay, folks, today I am going to try to shed some light on this whole Ukrainian situation. Going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into some history to help you guys understand geopolitics a little more. Well, at least more than, your represented, your elected officials. Wow, I can't believe anybody voted for her. So I'm going to do a quick summary of what's been going on, and then I'm going to do a deep dive into the history so that you can see where I'm getting this information from that I'm about to just quickly go over. Essentially, back in 1990, we promised Russia that we weren't going to expand NATO any further to the east, and this was done in exchange for them giving up control of Germany. Of course, we broke that promise, and that's leaving Russia not wanting basically the ability to have like nukes on their front porch. You can't really blame them for not wanting that to happen. Then Ukraine went through a series, and not just Ukraine, but several other former Soviet countries. What happened was multiple times with multiple countries was that if they would get a pro-Russian leader in charge, America would come in with our Western allies like George Soros would come in and fund color revolutions. You can call them that, you can call them coups, whatever you want, but we would oust the pro-Russian leaders, and then we would install our own pro-Western leaders. And then once the pro-Western leaders come in, that's when the money laundering gets out of control, the human trafficking and the Hunter Bidens show up, with their money for the big guy, And so that leaves countries like Ukraine that has a pretty decently sized ethnic and ethnically Russian and pro-Russian population. That's left a lot of these countries like that in conflict. And in the Ukraine, there is a group called the Azov Battalion. It actually is a neo-Nazi organization that has a history of being, anti-immigrant, anti-Jew, anti-Gypsy, like anti-homosexual, anti-transvestite. But yeah, and they actually even wear the Wolf's Angel symbol from the SS. They have that on their arm, and I'll show that to you in pictures. But yes, Putin actually is fighting against the neo-Nazis in the Ukraine, and those neo-Nazis have been particularly brutal. They have burned protesters alive. It's a big mess. And I'm not here to tell you who you should be rooting for in this conflict. I'm just here to try to explain the conflict, and however you feel about it is however you feel about it. Okay, but that's basically how we got there. And now it's time for the receipts. So without any further ado, one of the things that makes the turmoil that's going on in Ukraine so complicated is that the Western Ukrainians and the Eastern Ukrainians, on average, are very different, and they have very different outlooks on things. So in the West, they are more pro-European. In the East, they're closer to Russia, and they're more pro-Russian. In the West, they tend to speak Ukrainian. In the East, there are a lot more native Russians who are native Russian speakers. And in the West, they look at Russia with suspicion. And then through the East, they look at Russia through the lens of a shared history. So the West is going to be, pro NATO, pro EU. And then the East is going to be more pro-Russia. Other things to consider is that 1 in 6 Ukrainians is actually an ethnic Russian, and 1 in 3 speaks Russian as a native language. In this next video, we're going to be focusing on this area of the Ukraine here, which is the Donbass area.
So on Monday, Russia's President Vladimir Putin officially recognized 2 breakaway areas in eastern Ukraine. Both of them are in the Donbass region. They call themselves the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, and they've been controlled by pro-Russian separatists since 2014 with Russia's backing. Now, these so-called People's Republics make up around 1/3 of the Ukrainian districts of Luhansk and Donetsk, and there's what's called a line of control, with the separatists on one side and the Ukrainian forces on the other. They've been fighting each other off and on across that line for years, even though there's supposed to be a ceasefire. One thing to keep in mind is that the separatists lay claim to all of Luhansk and Donetsk, not just the 1/3 they control now. And Putin confirmed that Russia's recognition of the independence of these so-called People's Republics also includes their claim to that extra territory.
So I think it's also important to consider what the Ukrainians themselves think. And 70% of them reject the one people thought. That's the concept that they're just all one homogenous group. So a lot of them, they feel that the ethnic Russians who speak Russian as a first language, they are not the same people who think of themselves as ethnic Ukrainians and then those people would be the ones who Ukrainian is their first language. So they do not feel like they are one giant united people. 72% consider Russia to be a hostile state. 33.3% are ready to take up arms against Russia. 21.7% are ready to stage a civil resistance. 67% want to join the EU, and 59% want to join NATO. And I think that you can see these numbers reflected in what's going on with the fighting in the Donbass region. Like typically in America, we see ourselves as, oh, hey, like we're all Americans. As long as you're actually, a legal American and you're here legally, yes, then we're all Americans, no matter what country you're from, no matter what your native language was. That's how we tend to see each other, but that's not what's going on in Ukraine. All of this information leads to even more questions. Questions like, why is only 33.3% of the population ready to take up arms against Russia? Or why are the Ukrainians bombing their own people in the Donbass area? And is Putin just a madman who attacked Ukraine for no reason at all? Basically, what events led to where we are today? And in order to figure that out, we're going to have to go back in time. So now I'm going to jump into a bit of a history lesson here. I'm going to start off with this LA Times article, op-ed, Russia's got a point, the US broke a NATO promise. And this article is explaining why Russia feels like it's the aggrieved party. After the Berlin Wall fell, Europe's regional order hinged on the question of whether a reunified Germany would be aligned with the United States and NATO or the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, or neither. Policymakers in George H.W. Bush's administration decided in early 1990 that NATO should include the reconstituted German Republic. In early February 1990, U.S. leaders made the Soviets an offer. According to transcripts from the meeting in Moscow on February 9th, then Secretary of State James Baker suggested that in exchange for cooperation on Germany, the U.S. could make ironclad guarantees that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. Less than a week later, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to begin reunification talks. No formal deal was struck, but from all the evidence, the quid pro quo was clear. Gorbachev acceded to Germany's Western alignment and the US would limit NATO's expansion. The West has vigorously protested that no such deal was ever struck. However, hundreds of memos, meeting minutes, and transcripts from the US archives indicate otherwise. Although what the documents reveal isn't enough to make Putin a saint, it suggests that the diagnosis of Russian predation isn't entirely fair. Europe's stability may depend just as much on the West's willingness to reassure Russia about NATO's limits as on deterring Moscow's adventurism. So in case you were wondering how well that worked out, yeah, it worked out like this. And I think you can understand why Putin wouldn't want NATO expanding closer and closer to the borders of Russia. They don't want nukes on their front porch, just like we didn't want nukes on our front porch during the whole Cold War when they tried to pull that stunt down in Cuba. All right, nobody wants that. So he doesn't want that. He's kind of defending his area. So yes, in February of 1990, essentially we said we wouldn't move any further to the east. And then this map here from NPR, it's just showing NATO's eastward expansion. So in the light blue, these countries here, they joined before 1992. And then all these countries here have joined post 1992 after we said that we wouldn't do that. Go ahead, give us Germany and we won't expand. And then boom. So I think you can see why Putin might be a bit peeved about the situation. All right, we're going to jump forward to 1991. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine became independent, but wound up with a lot of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. And in 1994, the Ukraine gave the nukes to Russia in exchange for guaranteeing their sovereignty and security. And they did so by signing the Budapest Memorandum. Not a big fan of Wikipedia, but to my knowledge, information I'm covering here is accurate. So I'm going to jump 10 years into the future. We're going to go from 1994 to 2004. This is where we start going back and forth between Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. These guys both want to be president of Ukraine. Viktor Yushchenko is pro-Western, and then Viktor Yanukovych is pro-Russian. Just a quick little Spygate tie-in here. Pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych is who Paul Manafort was working for when they took a FISA out on him in 2014. And they let that FISA warrant expire and did nothing with the case because they didn't find anything. And everything was fine with Paul Manafort until Trump became president. Okay, so in 2004, you have the runoff vote of the 2004 Ukrainian presidential election. The pro-Russian Yanukovych, he wins. And then that's when America comes in with George Soros and we fund the Orange Revolution. We launch a coup. We meddle in the Ukraine's affairs. We will launch a coup. We have Yanukovych, pro-Russian Yanukovych. He gets ousted. And then we replace him with pro-Western Yushchenko. And we spend $41 million to do this. And so I'm going to go over to an article from The Guardian to show some receipts, because we don't just do this to the Ukraine. We do it a couple of other places. So now we're getting into the George Soros funded Orange Revolution and a couple of other revolutions with this article here from The Guardian, U.S. campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. So yeah, that was us. We did this. Ukraine, traditionally passive in its politics, has been mobilized by the young democracy activists and will never be the same again. But while the gains of the orange bedecked chestnut revolution are Ukraine's, the campaign is an American creation. An American creation. A sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. I don't think that I can fairly say that they were duly elected, but I don't think that these people can say that they were not duly elected. What I can definitively say is that we're meddling in other countries and we're getting rid of pro-Russian folks in favor of pro-Western folks. Funded and organized by the U.S. government, deploying U.S. consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the 2 big American parties, and the U.S. non-government organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. Richard Miles, the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. And by last year, as U.S. ambassador in Tbilisi, he repeated the trick in Georgia coaching Mikhail Saakashvili in how to bring down Edward Shevardnadze. 10 months after the success in Belgrade, the U.S. ambassador in Minsk, Michael Kozak, a veteran of similar operations in Central America, notably in Nicaragua, organized a near identical campaign to try to defeat the Belarus hardman, Alexander Lukashenko. That one failed. There will be no Kostianka in Belarus, the Belarus president declared, referring to the victory in Belgrade. But experience gained in Serbia, Georgia, and Belarus has been invaluable in plotting to beat the regime of Leonid Kuchma in Kiev. The operation, engineering democracy through the ballot box and civil disobedience, is now so slick that the methods have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. In the center of Belgrade, there is a dingy office staffed by computer literate youngsters who call themselves the Center for Nonviolent Resistance. If you want to know how to beat a regime that controls the mass media, the judges, the courts, the security apparatus, and the voting stations, the young Belgrade activists are for hire. They emerged from the anti-Milosevic student movement, Otpor, meaning resistance. The catchy single word branding is important. In Georgia last year, the parallel student movement was Kamara. In Belarus, it was Zubr. In Ukraine, it is Pora, meaning high time. Otpor also had a potent, simple slogan that appeared everywhere in Serbia in 2000. The two words, Gotovji, meaning he's finished, a reference to Milosevic. A logo of a black and white clenched fist completed the masterful marking. You know what's funny about these color revolutions is that they don't even change their logos. Like it's Antifa and like this resistance, and they actually use the same. Let me just pull this up. Yeah, just like the Antifa flag is based on the German communist paramilitary flag. Yeah. It's nothing new under the sun. There's a never-ending supply of young people who are intentionally kept ignorant of history and facts, and so they wind up falling for the most basic of things. And you just want to scream at them, hello, you're being manipulated. They're not even changing the playbook. This is one of the most obvious cons ever. And they're like, no, this is something new. We created this. We're not being manipulated. Okay, whatever. Last year, before becoming president in Georgia, the U.S. educated Mr. Saakashvili traveled from Tbilisi to Belgrade to be coached in the techniques of mass defiance. In Belarus, the U.S. Embassy organized the dispatch of young opposition leaders to the Baltic, where they met up with Serbs traveling from Belgrade. In Serbia's case, given the hostile environment in Belgrade, the Americans organized the overthrow from neighboring Hungary, Budapest, and Szeged. See, if this were America, though, they would be giving them a pallet of bricks, too. Just dropping off random pallets of bricks here and there. In recent weeks, several Serbs traveled to the Ukraine. Oh, by the way, this article is from 2004, so this is not recent weeks. This is an old article. Indeed, one of the leaders from Belgrade, Alexander Marek, was turned away at the border. The Democrat Party's National Democratic Institute, the Republican Party's International Republican Institute, the U.S. State Department, and USAID are the main agencies involved in these grassroots campaigns, as well as the Freedom House NGO and billionaire George Soros's Open Society Institute. So, hey, there it is. And this is the UK. This is the Guardian here. And this is the Guardian reporting this, okay? This isn't some conspiracy theory website. There it is. There's Soros and the US government. And this is just open and naked proof of us interfering in other countries' business. The usually fractious oppositions have to be united behind a single candidate if there is to be any chance of unseating the regime. That leader is selected on pragmatic and objective grounds, even if he or she is anti-American. In Serbia, U.S. pollsters Penn, Sloan, and Berlin Associates discovered that the assassinated pro-Western opposition leader Zoran Djindjic was reviled at home and had no chance of beating Milosevic fairly in an election, he was persuaded to take a backseat to the anti-Western Vojislav Kostunica, who is now Serbian prime minister. In Belarus, U.S. officials ordered opposition parties to unite behind the door elderly trade unionist Vladimir Goncharik because he appealed to much of Lushenko's constituency. Officially, the U.S. government spent $41 million organizing and funding the year-long operation to get rid of Milosevic from October of 1999. In Ukraine, the figure is said to be around 14 million. Apart from the student movement and the united opposition, the other key element in the democracy template is what is known as the parallel vote tabulation, a counter to the election rigging tricks beloved of the disreputable regimes. So basically, you just do your own version of rigging. This is what they do. There are professional outside election monitors from bodies such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, but the Ukrainian poll, like its predecessors, also featured thousands of local election monitors that were trained and paid by Western groups. I'm sure they feel much better knowing that, they can all have the most freest and fair elections in the history of ever once the Americans come in with their own interests in mind and their own way of tabulating things. Yes, everyone gets super free and super fair elections. We get the pro-Western president in, and immediately Russia and Ukraine start having gas or natural gas pipeline issues because Russia's pipelines run through the Ukraine to get to Europe. So in the winter 2005, 2006, they start having a dispute over gas prices. In February 2007, Ukraine's parliament passes a law banning the privatization, sale, or lease of gas pipelines after Russia suggested creating a joint venture to run the system. We got Yushchenko over here doing the West's bidding, and that culminates in the winter of 2009. They're still fighting over the price of gas. Russia accused the Ukraine of corruption and stealing gas meant for Europe. On January 7th of 2009, Putin cut the gas off to Ukraine, which then cut it off to Europe. And this was at a time where Europe received 80% of its gas from Russia, natural gas. Yeah, a fifth of its total needs from pipelines that run via the Ukraine. Supplies to 18 countries in Europe have been disrupted after Gazprom cut off supplies. And he left that gas off for 13 days because Putin is not playing around. You can't steal from Putin. We're jumping forward again to 2010. We're having another election, another presidential election in the Ukraine. It's Yushchenko versus Yanukovych again. Yanukovych wins again. The pro-Russian wins. And guess what happens again? Another coup, another revolution. Except this time, at least they let the guy stay in office for a few years first. This one's called the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity. It took place in the Ukraine in February 2014. Now we're getting into Obama territory. And this is when things really, really, really got corrupt. This is when the Democrats start sending all their do-nothing useless kids in for all these jobs on these gas boards. These do-nothing jobs where they don't show up, and that they start sending money in. The money laundering is out of control. The human trafficking is out of control. Ukraine turns into one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Hunter Biden's in there getting his money. Nancy Pelosi's son is in there getting his money. John Kerry's stepson is in there. The Clinton Foundation, they're getting their money, even though they agreed not to seek donations from other governments, but the cash kept flowing from individuals tied to foreign governments, with Ukrainians being the number one group of donors. Everyone's making money except you and me. The fact checkers come in and say that the claims about John Kerry's stepson, Chris Hines, and Nancy Pelosi's kid, Paul Pelosi, about them getting Ukrainian money, You know, they say that's not true. And you know how they prove that's not true? Well, hey, look, they asked them. They said, hey, are you guys corrupt? And they said, no. So case closed. But of course, the story is never that simple. And this New York Post article, Inside the Shady Private Equity Firm Run by Kerry and Biden's Kids. My goodness. I mean, this is a very, very deep dive into a lot of the shady dealings. This article mostly focuses on what they were doing in China. But this article here from the Daily Caller, here's why John Kerry's son emailed the State Department about Hunter Biden in 2014. This one is going to give us the information about Chris Hines, John Kerry's stepson, and his involvement. Although this article is mostly about him trying not to be involved or trying to dissociate himself from Hunter Biden, but I'd say it was too little too late. Yeah, it's great that former Secretary of State John Kerry's stepson reportedly cut ties with Hunter Biden over the lawyer's Ukrainian oil deal in 2014. Chris Hines even went as far as to email two of his stepfather's top aides at the State Department. Yeah, he wrote, apparently Devin and Hunter both joined the board of Burisma, and a press release went out today. Hines wrote on May 13th, 2014, hours after Biden's appointment to the board was made public. I'm going to bounce over to this Red State article real quick, and I'm going to bounce back to the previous article. Devin Archer, Hines, and Biden were the three founding partners in a company called Rosemont Seneca Partners. Back to the Daily Caller article. Now that you know that Hines is a co-owner of Rosemont Seneca, you can see here that Burisma Holdings was the focus of a UK money laundering probe, and the company paid $3.4 million in 2014 and 2015 to Rosemont Seneca, according to the financial data cited in the New York Times. But Hines doesn't disassociate himself from Rosemont Seneca until 2015, which is millions of dollars later. It's amazing PolitiFact can't do this. And then what's going on with Paul Pelosi in the Ukraine? Well, Paul Pelosi was on the board of a natural gas firm named Viscali, and Viscali allegedly did business in Ukraine, according to the report from One American News. Paul Pelosi Jr. served on the board of Viscali, and the report highlighted his visit to Ukraine as recently as 2017. Yes, the One American News Network report alleged that Pelosi and her son, Paul Pelosi Jr., were involved in a similar Ukrainian corruption scandal as former Vice President Joe Biden and his son are accused of. There's even leaked audio of a call between then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pryat. And if the name Victoria Nuland sounds familiar, that's because we have another quick Spygate tie-in. Victoria Nuland admitted that during the waning days of the 2016 election, the Obama State Department hosted ex-British spy Christopher Steele to give a secret briefing to staff on his anti-Trump dossier. Back to the leaked phone call between Pryat and Nuland. In the leaked phone call, you can hear them deciding the fate of Ukrainian politics. Nuland says boxer turned politician Vitaly Klitschko and neo-Yahtzee Tiani Brock both need to stand back from the limelight while they let the guy that they picked, Yatsenyuk, be in the foreground as they remain as an integral part of the background. And screw the EU.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work. That would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
So when you hear people from the dying legacy media talking about how we have to preserve Ukraine's democracy, don't believe that for 1 minute. We don't care about their democracy. We only care about control. After the second Western-funded revolution, Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia. Putin struck back by annexing Crimea, and fighting broke out in the Donbass region. In 2014, the Minsk Accords were signed. The Minsk Accords were peace agreements that were designed to end the fighting in the Donbass region. But Russia accused Ukraine of violating the accords, and then the Ukraine accused Russia of violating the accords. The fighting that's been going on over there has been very brutal, with 81.4% of civilian casualties in the Donbass war zone coming from the rebel-held territory, while only 16.3% were in Ukrainian government-held territory. This discrepancy in numbers has caused some people to refer to this as a genocide of the ethnic Russians in Ukraine. One thing that doesn't help the pro-Ukrainian narrative is their ever-changing laws on language. And keep in mind that earlier I stated that 1/3 of the population are native Russian speakers. So pushing Russian out is causing a large percent of the population to feel disenfranchised. And in what is probably the biggest thing that paints Ukraine in a bad light is their use of the Azov Battalion. The Azov Battalion is a neo-Nazi group.
Are we the baddies?
So I'm going to get a little more into the Azov Battalion. Ukraine is bombing its own people, and they are using neo-Nazis known as the Azov Battalion to actually do some of their dirty work for them. And you can tell that they are neo-Nazis from the insignia here on their uniforms. Yeah, they use the Wolf's Angel insignia that was used by Hitler's SS in the Second World War, which basically looks like this or a version of this. But when we go back, that's their symbol. Yeah, in this photo, you can see it a little more clearly. It says, members of this group were recognized at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine in 2014. This group, as we noted, is violent, especially against groups like transvestites, gypsies, and immigrants. And don't forget the gays. They are not fans of the gays either. Not many Americans have heard of the Azov Battalion. Apparently, NBC was unaware of this group on February 14th when it aired preparations being made for a Russian attack into Ukraine using the Azov Battalion as its example. This was captured immediately by those in the know. In a news broadcast Monday evening, NBC's chief foreign policy correspondent Richard Engel told viewers how some communities in Ukraine are preparing for war with Russia by taking matters into their own hands. The report showed Ukrainian soldiers delivering basic training for the whole family, first aid, weapons training to a small group of Mariupol residents, including children and the elderly. One of them was 79-year-old Valentina Konstantinovska, wielding an AK-47, which was made the face of Ukrainian resistance by the world's newspapers. Engel left out of his account the fact that the military formation providing Konstantinovska's training was the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion, clearly identifiable by its Wolf's Angel insignia used by Hitler's SS in the Second World War. When Putin claimed that he was going to get rid of the Nazis in the Ukraine, NBC went all the way out of their way to just own themselves so hard, because this is what they shared. In announcing he had launched Russian forces against key Ukrainian military and logistics posts, Putin says he's striving for demilitarization and de-Yatsification of the sovereign democracy in Kiev. Putin has long sought to falsely paint Ukraine as a Yahtzee hotbed, which is a particularly jarring accusation given that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish and lost 3 members of his family in the Holocaust. Claiming to fight Yahtzees is really code for replacing the Ukrainian government, which is especially ironic given that the Ukrainian president is Jewish, said Andriy Dobryansky of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, an ethnic advocacy group based in New York City.
Basic training for the whole family, learning first aid to treat gun.
Yo, look at that. These guys are, they are interviewing the Yahtzees and they have no idea. No idea. This is a new low, even for the dying dinosaur legacy media. They're about as self-aware as the Gen Z TikTokers who are recommending that they get a Yahtzee tattoo as a Gen Z symbol to represent the idea of a rebellion. Yeah, can you guys remind me why locking the schools down and keeping the kids out of school? Remind me why that was a good idea. Kids, they don't know anything. Like, yeah, everybody in Gen Z, we should all get Yahtzee tattoos as a symbol of unity. That's all the time I have for today. If you made it all the way to the end, congratulations. You're a giant nerd, just like I am. I love you guys. I'll see you in the next video.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and please share it. You can help us continue to fight in the war against disinformation by donating at paypal.me/right-left-of-center. I'm River Wright from Right Left of Center, and if you're watching, you're probably right too.